that's being recorded now as well. Thank you, Paco. That was the other thing I was going to say, is today is going to be recorded and it will be hosted on the OpenTel blog afterwards. The presentation, the session will be uploaded there. We've got 3 presentations today. The first one is James Schwanethal, who'll be talking about ASD and me. This one will be the recording. We will play the recording of James' TEDx talk, and James is going to take questions asynchronously. So they are very keen to use this as a platform for starting discussion, but so that they've got the chance to really consider the questions properly. If you can post them in the chat with your email address, and then James will get back to you with an answer afterwards, if that's okay. The second presentation will be Annabel and Danna from the University of Ghent. So welcome to you guys. Thank you very much for joining us. They're going to be talking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on autistic adults, and talking about the research that their research group Explorer has been doing. They have a pre-recorded presentation for us, and we'll be doing live question and answer afterwards. And then our third presentation of the day is Laura Dean, who's a tutor at the Open University, who's going to be talking about autistic students in higher education. What problems do they face and how can we help? Laura's going to be presenting live, and we've also got live Q&A. So we've got the real range of all the kind of things that you can expect from an online session today. And then the last thing we'll do today, the last bit of the last activity that we'll do, I've been working on some guidance with input from some of the speakers and some other people as well, around how we can be inclusive in designing teaching and learning for autistic students. So we're in second draft territory now, so I'd love to just spend the last 15-20 minutes or so of today kind of getting your thoughts on that and capturing your comments, so that the third draft can be really quite inclusive with lots of different perspectives and wisdom in it, if that's okay. So I imagine we're probably going to finish around about 3:30, but you've got it in your diaries until 4, just in case it runs a little bit late. So I think that's everything from me, unless anybody has any particular housekeeping questions, and feel free to pop them in the chat as we go. But if nobody has any burning questions, I think we'll go to our first presentation. James Schwanethal. Paco, are you playing it or am I?
Yes, I am. So yeah.
Okay, you are. Fab. Thank you. I'll put myself on mute.
Three years ago, I tried to jump in front of a train. I was commuting to London at the time, and the train that should have passed in front of me, London passed behind me. For whatever reason on that day, it changed tracks. I didn't see the light immediately. I just saw this as additional evidence that I couldn't do anything right. My own train turned up, I got on it, I went to work, and I had a breakdown. This pattern of behaviour wasn't actually all that unusual for me. See, I haven't always been autistic. Before I was autistic, I was weird. I was the strange one, best avoided because of my unusual behaviours. I'd react in strange ways in seemingly normal situations. These situations would trigger what other people viewed as tantrums. I found situations where a lot of people were present particularly difficult, from giving talks to socialising down the pub, both of which, when you're a student, are hard to avoid. But I managed to avoid giving the talks. Socialising, though, was particularly painful. I'd have to drink to gain the confidence to talk to people, but the bars would be loud, in those days smoky, and the lights would be bright. It would be so packed I couldn't avoid people touching me. There'd be jokes that I wouldn't get, or I'd take personally, not being able to read from someone's face whether they were joking or being insulting, but I'd always assume the worst. And then as postgrad, I started my PhD and I had to add in doing all of this stuff, but at conferences, in new places which I'd have to fly to, which I hate, and where you have to talk to people because networking is what you do. It's how you become successful. So to cope a little better, I'd drink some more, and I'd wake up feeling paranoid, and knowing that I'd have to go through it again for the rest of the week. See, the problem is I have a limited capacity. My coping cup is quite small, and it would overflow, and the same triggers would become more and more painful, associating themselves with feelings of self-loathing and a firm belief that the people with me hated me. The rooms would get louder, the lights would get brighter, smells would get stronger. It would feel like the room and the people were closing in on me, and I'd crash. Sometimes I had a tantrum, and sometimes I ran away. Often I did both. I was always depressed and often suicidal. In addition to various locations in the UK, in 2000 I did this in Warsaw, in 2002 Berlin and Potsdam, and in 2003 I took my crazy tour to the Netherlands, Finland, and various cities in Germany. I couldn't understand what was happening. I'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but although the therapy helped, I couldn't find peace. I clearly had the depression, but the manic phases just didn't seem to fit. And then in 2018, I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. I felt liberated because I finally had an answer. I had that missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle. But when you tell people you're autistic, you get a couple of common responses. You don't look autistic. How am I meant to look? I could understand if they said you don't behave like you're autistic, because that would mean that I'm fitting in with what is perceived to be normal, but they don't say that. See, the severity of my autism is not how you see it, it's how I experience it. If I don't look autistic, it's because I can mask really well. And masking's like a camouflage that you wear to appear normal. But faking it like this takes energy, and by the end of the day, I'm exhausted. That's when the mask falls off, and that's when I crash. I also get told we're all somewhere on the spectrum. We're not. We might all have traits commonly associated with autism. Might be shy, might like numbers, might be obsessed by certain subjects. But being obsessed by your field of research doesn't make you autistic. That makes you ambitious. Autism isn't diagnosed by ticking off a few of these traits from a checklist. Our brains are wired differently. They function in different ways. We respond in different ways to stimuli. For me, I'm particularly hypersensitive to sound, sight, and smell. So loud, bright, smelly places can easily become overwhelming for me. You can imagine I don't go to many nightclubs. But the hypersensitivity has a flip side. It's really useful in the lab. Being sensitive to very small changes is great when you're troubleshooting. I can hear small changes in the frequency of vacuum pumps, smell when something starts to overheat, or just notice when indicator lights change or go out. Neurodiversity, this different wiring of the brain to neurotypical people, is not all negative. Expecting all autistic people to be shy loners stigmatizes the condition, as well as making us think, well, maybe I'm not autistic. I'm actually very social, but I don't know how to start a conversation. In fact, later on, if you see me stood by myself looking lost, I'll be hoping that someone will come and talk to me. But when they do, I'll feel like a fraud, because it's not how I'm supposed to behave. We need to push against this stereotypical view of what it means to be autistic. And despite all the weaknesses associated with autism, and there are a lot of weaknesses, I really believe it's one of my biggest strengths. For me, there are a lot of positives. For example, my PhD was about space debris. I wanted to know how much debris there was in a particular orbit, and so to do this, I used a dust impact detector called Debbie. And Debbie orbited the Earth a couple hundred miles up in a polar orbit. So that meant it went from pole to pole as the Earth spun below it. And this way, it covers just about every point on Earth. Each time, a piece of debris the size of the dust that you can see hanging in the lights hit a piece of aluminium foil the size of a CD case at 30,000 miles an hour. The electronics would trigger, beam it back down to Earth, and then I would analyze the data. I wrote some software so I could work out if what hit the sensor was indeed space debris or something else, something like dust from the tail of a comet that passed by decades ago. I downloaded the data knowing from the predictions I'd have 1, maybe 2 impacts to analyze for that month. These were the impacts for that month. This was an overwhelming amount of data. And this is just 1 month. For the entire data set, I must have had approaching 1 million events. But then I started to look at the data, and I started to see patterns, because I really like patterns, and I really like playing with data. I started to see events that only happened when the spacecraft went from sunlight into darkness, and vice versa. Another set of data only bizarrely happened when we passed over a particular radar station. It's fair to say that Debbie was hypersensitive. But the data wasn't just overwhelming for me. I could see that it was coming in bursts. I'd get a few days of a lot of data, and then Debbie would crash and recover, reset, and start the process all over again. Debbie was wired differently, and Debbie had a lot of triggers. It takes one to know one. And looking through all the data, I was able to identify these triggers, and after a lot of processing, remove all this noise, just be left with the real impacts. You're going to have to trust me on this one or read my thesis. So I was diagnosed with autism at the age of 42. And that might seem relatively old, but when I was at school, there was nothing else I could be diagnosed with. Asperger's wasn't then a diagnosable condition in the UK. I was too so-called high-functioning to be diagnosed with autism. And that's going to be the case for many people in my generation. I was diagnosed because I felt different and I asked for help, but many don't. You probably work with people who fit all the diagnostic criteria for autism, but like me, they're just the weird one. And even if you do seek a diagnosis, the waiting list can be so long that you're left in limbo, knowing that you need adjustments to be made, but not having the piece of paper that you need as evidence. And even if you regard autism as a label, a diagnosis, an identity, you might not want to know because of the stigma that the word autism has. But that's no reason not to provide support. If we only support people with a diagnosis in autism, we're missing out a chunk of the population who, for whatever reason, don't have that diagnosis. We need to help those people seek a diagnosis so that those who've fallen under the radar or who are afraid of the stigma still have a hope of a normal life. And this is important because autistic people have a higher suicide rate than the general population. These statistics of people diagnosed with Asperger's: 66% had suicidal thoughts. 1 in 3 planned or attempted suicide. Most of my suicidal thoughts came before diagnosis, but autism isn't a mental illness, and autism doesn't cause depression. Failure to cope in a neurotypical world causes depression. Being bullied or mocked or made to feel lonely makes you suicidal. Only 16% of autistic adults are in full-time employment, yet the stats show that over 3/4 of those who are unemployed want to work. Why is there this disparity? It's time to look at the individual beyond the stereotype. If you employ someone who's autistic, rather than send them to occupational health to see how they say we should treat someone on the spectrum, ask the individual what adjustments they require. Autistic people can be honest, hardworking, determined, kind-hearted, with an amazing attention to detail. We can process information in ways in which neurotypical people can't imagine doing. Our brains and our characters, our traits, they don't need fixing or changing. But most importantly, we're all different. There's as much diversity amongst the neurodiverse as there is amongst the neurotypical. I'm fortunate that I work in a group that sees the values my condition above the detriments. And this started at the interview when I was able to have a few minutes beforehand to let my mind calm down. There were no handshakes in the interview, and I was able to sit in an area of the room that had no distractions. And these might seem like really minor adjustments, but they had a significant impact. I got the job. I was able to then work in an area of the office with no fluorescent lighting, and again, no visual distractions. If there's a problem, we can have a conversation and make further adjustments. I feel accepted, and I don't have to wear the mask. As a result, I'm at my most productive, but I realise that this isn't going to be the case for everyone. I'm lucky. What worked for me doesn't work for everyone else, and you have to have the conversation. My brain has made me what I am today, and there's nothing about it I would change. I failed to cope with the world, but the world fails to cope with me. For the neurotypical people in the audience, imagine a world in which we, the neurodiverse, were the majority. So imagine a neurodiverse world. How would you feel not being able to be spontaneous in a world that desires predictability? So where I work, a group of us have recently started up a neurodiverse staff network. It's a safe space for people with autism, Asperger's, ADHD, or other neurodiverse conditions. If you think you might be on the spectrum, you're also welcome. If any member of our staff wants to learn how to be more inclusive, they can come along and talk to us. We're going to be starting conversation with groups such as HR, estates, IT, in order to help each other. Autistic employees can add so much to your organisation. If someone's brave enough to disclose their autism to you, don't question their diagnosis. Ask what you can do to help and start a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for that amazing presentation, which has lost nothing over time. I think I've seen that presentation about 5 times now. I was lucky enough to be in the audience and see it live, and I was lucky enough to see it in the rehearsal as well. and it has just absolutely lost nothing. Yeah, as Vicky says, what a powerful video. So for anybody with any questions, please pop them in the chat. If you have a question for James, please pop your email address in with it. Christina, because she's amazing, is going to collate them and send them either to me to forward to James or to James directly. If anybody has any other comments or questions or anything just to start a dialogue with the other people in this group, I can see there are now 50 of us. Feel free to also pop those in the chat, just in the box below. I'll give you a couple of minutes now just to do that before we'll go on to our next presentation. So do feel free just to pop any comments, any thoughts, any impressions, as well as any questions that you have for Jen. So I'll have a couple of minutes just for people to gather their thoughts and put any comments or anything. But I can't stand the silence, so I'm going to fill it. Yeah, Kirsty, that's a really good point. So Kirsty makes the point that that it's quite likely that not everyone will have a diagnosis, but we do still need to support them. And I wonder how we can make sure that happens. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There's so much we can do by being inclusive in our practice in general, both in our teaching practice and in workplace practice as well. So it's, I suppose an awful lot of it is having those conversations, because as James says, there's as much diversity within the neurodiverse as there is within the neurotypical. So everybody will have different ways and different things that they need or that work for them. So I think that's an absolutely great point. And invite everybody to think about it, and feel free to post any answers or any ideas that you have. So I think we'll have 2 more minutes in the kind of chat conversation now, and then we'll move on to the next one. Yeah, Vicky says it seems like common sense when James mentioned it to ask someone what they need to do their job well, but I bet it's done far less than it should be. Yeah, I bet you're right. And it's interesting that this is one of the areas in which lockdown is actually giving us an opportunity to do things better in some ways as well, because I don't know, maybe this is just my impression, but I think it's understood that people are coping differently and setting up their workspaces differently under lockdown. So there's almost more play for flexibility. Maybe not, maybe there's not in everyone, but at least you can be in your own space and with the lighting that you prefer and things like that. Yeah, so Vicky Boskill agrees. Yeah, it's made things much more accessible for you. Yeah, there was somebody else I was chatting to this morning who said the same thing. They were struggling with the fluorescent lighting where they were working, and they were actually in the process of negotiating to work from home 2 days a week. And yeah, this has changed things for that. Yeah, I can see multiple attendees are typing, so yeah, Andrew, I bet you're right. The open plan office thing probably has made things a lot harder for people. Yeah, I imagine. Okay, Hannah says that lockdown's put her on an even footing with everyone else. Oh, James, thanks for your comment. I know you weren't planning to, but that's great that you've been able to comment. I can imagine it feels extremely overwhelming watching it again. It was such an emotive day, terrifying day. I can imagine it must be quite hard to watch. But I think, yeah, it's had a strong response here today. Okay, so at this point, oh, okay, sorry, I'll just read Hayley's comment quickly. Oh, okay, so it's made life harder for your son. Is that the lockdown? Right, that's interesting. Yes, yes, I can imagine in a school situation it must be, yeah, and I suppose it's a big change. Yeah, so Abby's got an interesting point. One thing that resonates with me is the issue of spending time in large groups. Being visually impaired, I don't pick up visual signals from faces, etc., and I can't tell who I know already. Yeah, yeah, that's so it's sorry, Abby, is it the change to online, or is it the or is it James's video? Sorry, I've lost the plot now, I'm afraid. Okay, this is certainly sparking a lot more conversation than. Oh, from James's video, right? Okay, thanks. Yes, Olivia, the video is available online. We can probably post the link, but if you just Google James Schwanethal TEDx, or if you go to the Open University TEDx events, you'll find it there. You can Google it as well. Yes, and I imagine that the links. Oh, there we go, Mandy, you legend. Thank you very much. I didn't trust myself to do it, but that's brilliant. Yeah. There was some really good talks that day. I recommend watching some of the other ones as well. Some of them were absolutely fantastic. But yeah, I think James's one hit us all particularly hard on the day. It was just an amazing talk and beautifully delivered. Thank you again so much, James, and thank you so much for coming today as well. It's been brilliant to have you here. So, but don't go, by the way. Sorry, feel free to stay. That sounded like I was dismissing you, and I didn't mean that. Okay, everybody. Oh, okay. So we've one more comment from Laura, and then I'll move on to the next presentation. So face blindness. I have an awful problem with it, so I assume other people do as well. Consequently, when a student arrives at a tutorial, I always introduce myself, even if I've met them before, just in case they don't recognise me. Yeah, that's something that really resonates with me. I'm horrific with faces. I don't have actual face blindness. I do know well that feeling of looking at people and having no idea if I've met them before or not. So yeah, yeah. So Hayley said she can't recognise her children. That is an amazing thing. Okay, thank you everybody so much for all your comments and for being so open in your comments as well. It's brilliant to talk to you about this. Okay, at this point we're going to move on to the next presentation. Any more comments that you've got on James's presentation, do feel free to keep popping them in the chat, and we'll come back to them and touch on them later. And likewise, if there's anything that you wanted to email to James directly, feel free to put it in the comments and we can pick it up and send it to him, or you can email him directly as well. I'm sure that's okay. Okay, so we're now going to move on to our second presentation of the day, which is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on autistic adults by Danna and Annabel from the University of Ghent and the research group Explorer. So we're going to play the presentation now, and Danna and Annabel are both here today to answer live question and answer afterwards. So so Paco, whenever you're ready, if you want to press the play button.
Hi everyone. This is a pre-recorded talk, but after the talk we will come online for the Q&A to answer any questions. The first part of the talk will be by me, I'm Danna, and the second part of the talk will be by a colleague of mine, Annabel. So today we would like to discuss our research on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on autistic adults. As you probably all know, the core diagnostic criteria for autism include two symptom domains: social and communication difficulties, and repetitive and restricted behavior, interests and activities. This last domain also includes a preference for sameness, sticking to routines, and difficulties with transitions. As we've probably all experienced, the COVID-19 pandemic has an influence on our social life due to social distancing, but also more generally on our daily life and how we structure it. as many of us, for instance, had to start studying or working from home and couldn't continue our hobbies or activities as we usually did. The pandemic has an influence on society as a whole, but it might have an even greater influence on autistic individuals, as both of the symptom domains of autistic individuals are impacted by the pandemic. Therefore, many organizations and media outlets have been posting articles with personal experiences and also tips and advices for autistic adults. Me and my colleagues wanted to contribute as researchers by getting a better and more complete image of the impact of the pandemic and the needs of autistic individuals by asking them directly, so that any support or advice can be tailored to their specific needs. We've therefore set up this study on the impact of the pandemic on autistic adults. With this study, we first of all focused on the impact of the pandemic on the mental health of autistic adults by investigating its effect on depression and anxiety symptoms. But we also investigated whether autistic adults worried more or less than usual on certain topics, such as their marriage or their work. And then besides that, we also wanted to know the influence of the pandemic on specifically the two autism symptom domains. So we've also formulated some questions regarding the impact on their social life and their everyday life and routines. Furthermore, we wanted to know about guidance. Are they receiving any guidance from a qualified specialist at the moment? And if not, would they want to? And if so, is there a wish for guidance linked to the pandemic or not? Or a little bit of both? Lastly, to get a bit more of a broader insight, we've also included some open questions, so we can get more information on why specifically they feel, for example, more or less anxious or depressed, and to see if we could identify any recurrent topics mentioned by most people or mentioned by mostly autistic individuals. So for this study, we wanted to reach as many people as possible to increase reliability of our results. But at the same time, we wanted to follow the social distancing rules ourselves. And therefore, we chose to do an online survey study. We included people with and without autism, so to also have a control group. And we focused on adults that are living in the UK, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And as the survey was in English, all participants needed sufficient knowledge of the English language. So what did we include in our survey? We included demographics and some autism-related questions, such as whether or not they had an official diagnosis and a short version of the AQ to assess autism symptoms. We included personal situation questions. These are questions inquiring about their living situation. So for instance, with how many adults and children they were living when they were filling in the questionnaire. But also more COVID-19 specific questions, such as whether they have had the virus and how much time they have spent actively looking up information on the virus, as all of these things could have an influence on how someone experiences the pandemic. To assess mental health, we included standardized depression and anxiety questionnaires. To assess worries, we included these topics as presented on the slide. The scales always covered the whole range, so not only if they got more anxious, depressed, or worried, but also if they could also indicate it if they felt less anxious, depressed, or worried. So to not skew the data to only the negative, as some people might experience some improvement. For example, some people actually very much like it to work from home more often. Here you can see the questions regarding the influence of the pandemic on the two autism symptom domains. We always included one question inquiring about the degree of change they experienced. So to what extent the pandemic has changed their social life, for example. And then included two statements per domain. One negative statement, for example, I feel socially isolated. and one positive statement. For example, I feel relieved from social stress. We chose to include a positive and a negative statement instead of putting them on one axis because the two aren't really mutually exclusive. It is entirely possible for someone to feel socially isolated, but at the same time feel relieved from social stress. As mentioned earlier, we asked some questions regarding whether or not they received any guidance. But we also had a question on the tips and tools that were created for autistic individuals specifically by several organizations. We asked participants with autism whether it was important to them that autistic individuals are consulted for the development of such tips and tools, and whether they were satisfied with the tools being offered. A modified version of the last question was also given to the control group, or the group without autism. We concluded the questionnaire with some open questions that weren't mandatory, but a large proportion filled them in anyway. First of all, we asked about their needs. So what measures could be taken to help them manage their mental health during this period? And then we asked them what they've experienced as the most difficult or the most stress or anxiety provoking, to gather a better insight of why they felt worse if this was the case. And then lastly, we asked if there were any COVID-19 changes that made their life more pleasant, as to also see if there were any positive side effects.
All right, at this point I will take over from Danna to tell you something about the actual results that we found with our survey study. So we spread the survey via social media channels, and also we sent them to existing databases that we have of people that have indicated to be interested to participate in our research. And finally had a sample of 1,044 participants, of whom 613 indicated to have a formal diagnosis of autism or autism spectrum disorder. The average age was around 38 years old. And we did test a majority of females, and this is something to keep in mind when interpreting our results, especially because usually more males are actually diagnosed with autism. And finally, the years of education were roughly equal between our groups, which is a very rough indication of equal IQ between the autism and the control group. It's important to mention that, as we said earlier, we tested individuals from both Belgium, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, but we didn't find any significant differences between those three groups, so therefore we report the results as a whole across the three countries. So the main finding of our study is that across the two groups, so taking together the autistic and the non-autistic individuals, about 75% reported that since the start of the pandemic, they had experienced an increase in depression-related symptoms as well as in anxiety-related symptoms. And that when comparing between the groups, the autistic adults reported a greater increase, both in depression-related and in anxiety-related symptoms. And when we consider that already ordinarily, so before the pandemic, autistic individuals experience more depression and anxiety, the fact that now they report a greater increase is particularly worrisome. When looking at the results of the question about particular worries during the pandemic, we see that autistic individuals worry significantly more than the control group about their pets, that is, if they have any, about their own safety and security during the pandemic, about access to medication, about following the recommendations by the government of how to prevent the spread of the virus correctly, and about getting food. And we see that some of these worries also come back in an open-ended question about the pandemic-related changes that cause the most stress and anxiety. For example, answers to this question made it clear that the stress that is experienced from wanting to correctly follow the government's recommendations is exacerbated because the rules are not always clear, particularly to autistic individuals. By far the most often reported anxiety-provoking topics for autistic adults are related to grocery shopping. The reasons that were mentioned for this were twofold. Firstly, routines of shopping are disrupted since the start of the pandemic. because certain products are unavailable. There are limits introduced on how much time you can spend in the shop or how many of a certain product you can buy, and people have to line up in order to be allowed to enter the shop. The second reason is the social distancing rules. Firstly, people find it very difficult to follow these rules when they are in a shop because of the narrow aisles and how busy it is with other people. And secondly, they see in the shop that other people are not following the social distancing rules, which causes a lot of stress and frustration. So all of this together makes shopping a stressful activity for many autistic adults. So our advice would be to advertise specific shopping times that could be autism friendly, but also introducing sort of a buddy system, so pairing up someone that wants to do the shopping to an autistic adult. However, of course, we realize that already the rules are changing again and things are more and more returning to normal. So these suggestions may have been more valid at the start of the pandemic. When asked about the effects of the changes to their routines, control group individuals indicate that they are feeling that their routines are affected more. However, autistic adults feel more stressed about these changes to their daily routines. So even though they experience less changes, they do feel more stress about it than the control group. However, on the other hand, they do also see more positive side effects of these changes to their routines. For example, they enjoy the freedom to deviate from society's expectations when they are adjusting to new routines. So, to name an example, they can spend much more time on their hobbies or interests, whereas they have to spend less time on obligatory social contact. The loss of structure and routines was also very often mentioned in response to the open question asking which changes due to the pandemic people have found most difficult. And what is very important to consider in the current moment that we're in, so a few months into the pandemic, is that many autistic individuals indicated that this difficulty would occur again as soon as we start changing things back to normal, whether it be slowly or with very sudden changes. So an example quote of an autistic adult can be seen here. I feel the relief of not having to mask anymore, but simultaneously the worry that I will not be able to join back the rat race as quickly as the others. When things will open back up, expectations of enjoying the social get-together will be super high, and I will be enormously stressed and out of practice in acting normal. So I think this is important to consider now that changes have slowly been reversing back, at least in Belgium and the Netherlands already, to maybe a somewhat higher extent than in the UK. Regarding the effect of the pandemic on people's social life, autistic adults feel more relief from certain social stressors than individuals in the control group. For example, there are no obligatory parties and appointments, no spontaneous visits from others, and strangers get less close to them. However, they also indicate that the pandemic introduces new social difficulties that they struggle with. For example, the use of face masks, which covers half of the face, makes reading someone's facial expression more difficult. And this is something that many autistic adults already have difficulty with in normal situations. Another thing that was indicated a couple of times was the difficulty with the back and forth flow in video calls, which are of course much more popular in these pandemic times. Secondly, the control group indicated to feel more socially isolated than the autistic adults. This is not very surprising when you consider that autistic adults usually have already a smaller social circle, but this does not mean that autistic adults are not feeling socially isolated or have less need for social contact. In fact, the difficulty that was most mentioned by both of the groups that was a result of the pandemic was the loss of social contact. So both groups struggle with this. With autistic individuals already more likely than neurotypical individuals to face loneliness and social isolation, losing the access to their support network appears to be a burden in this already stressful time. This is well illustrated by this quote from an autistic adult. The stress of not being able to see loved ones outside the house and feeling crippled by social isolation with no idea when it will end. I feel that a neurotypical person in this situation will have a vast number of people to interact with in varying ways. I have 2 who I'm in touch with outside my home, and only one is via Skype. As an autistic, I have a limited social circle, and now it's even smaller. I worry about other autistics who live alone consistently too. When asked about their need for guidance and support throughout the pandemic, autistic adults indicate that they are not completely satisfied as it is currently with the autism-specific tips and tools that are available. For example, they think that autistic individuals should be consulted more and asked for their own input in the development of such available tips and tools. Also, they feel that more of these tips and tools should be directed at autistic adults, in contrast to many tools that are available directed at autistic children or parents of autistic children. Also, the tools should be made more widely available and more accessible. There are already some available tools out there, but autistic adults indicate they are not always aware of them or it's hard to find them, and there are too many different sources. Further, when asked about their need for mental health support, they say that they would need access to the appropriate services and continued support. Of course, the mental health system is overstretched in this current pandemic, so some support has had to be stopped. However, even adults that before the pandemic did not need any support feel that they would need it now, but feel overwhelmed by all the different rules and things that they need to do in order to access mental health care. It should be affordable and easily accessible. Of course, this is not always realizable, but another important point is that, of course, they understand that some support had to be cancelled for the moment, but where possible, it should be restarted as soon as possible, ideally face-to-face. But if there's no other alternative, it could also be done, for example, via video call or online. It's important that many autistic adults indicate that they find video calls and normal calls quite stressful, so maybe a chat option or an email support can be more suitable to some individuals, and this is, should be taken into account. We would like to end on a slightly more positive note by discussing the results of the question that asked about positive pandemic-related changes. So many autistic adults indicate that they receive crucial support from within the autistic community, as experiences are often shared with one another. Furthermore, they feel that the pandemic has resulted in an increased ASD awareness in society and a feeling of solidarity among other human beings. So one quote illustrates this very beautifully, saying that as the entire nation is on lockdown and everyone is self-isolating, I feel like I am finally at one with society. My way of living life is the norm. I no longer have to feel alone. I have a sense of belonging, that everyone is in the same situation and we're all in this together. To conclude, we would like to highlight again our main findings with this online survey study. Firstly, we observed an increase in anxiety and depression-related symptoms across both groups, autistic and non-autistic. However, this increase was greater for autistic adults, and this is quite worrisome, as already anxiety and depression are higher in this population. Furthermore, we found that autistic adults had specific worries about their pets, their medication, grocery shopping, and following recommendations about the COVID-19 regulations. So, autistic adults feel that they need continued guidance wherever that is possible, and also indicate a need for autism-specific tailored tips and tools. The survey indicated that there are both positive and negative aspects of both changes to routines as well as changes to social communication and interactions. All of these are important to consider when we think about the impact that this pandemic has on autistic adults. We would like to thank you very much for listening to this presentation of our results, and we are available now for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annabel and Danna. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Would you guys like to join by video as well?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there we are.
Thing that looks like an alien at the top of the okay, and then I think you have to click on the start sharing. I can't see you yet.
Yeah, sorry, I keep forgetting. Okay.
No, I just done the same. I just did exactly the same. I thought I was sharing and I wasn't. There we go. Okay, great. We can see you now. Thank you for that. Okay, So questions from everybody, either in the chat or feel free to speak. We've got live Q&A and we've got about 10 or 15 minutes for this.
Great.
Okay, so we've got our first question from Kathy. Did any respondents comment on redundancy concerns or experiences, so losing their jobs or anything around that?
Yeah, I think some individuals were worried about that. I don't think that we read already a lot of input. This was really at the start of the pandemic. So the survey was online in the beginning of April towards the beginning of May. But they were very concerned about that happening in the near future. Because of course, as we already saw in James' presentation, a lot of autistic adults are already unemployed and yeah, more and more, yeah, this becomes a risk because of the financial economic situation as well, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Just for context, Kathy is in our careers team at the OU. So Kathy, I don't know if you wanted to comment. I'm going to put you right on the spot now. I don't know if you wanted to comment on any ideas about how careers teams can help autistic students with their anxiety around this.
We've already run a forum back in May for our students with disabilities, and one of the threads we offered were concerns relating to COVID and employment, and many groups of students were very concerned about this, and then the whole process of job seeking and having to think about interviews. So what we've offered so far, we've already run a forum for our students. So that's what we've done so far, and that was very well used by students. I hope that helps.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Kathy. So if anyone else has any other thoughts around that or around any other aspects of the presentation, feel free to put them in the comments or feel free to speak out. Got a comment from Vicky saying, what interesting research, some great lessons that are relevant still and should be taken on board if a similar event happens again. Yeah, I don't know, it keeps coming up again and again, isn't there? That there's so much that we can learn from what we're doing now, and just making sure that we do actually learn from it and that we apply it somehow. Yeah, absolutely.
Still be applied because we have a lot of changes right now happening, like changing back to normal, and they express need for help right now, I guess. Like the help we couldn't offer in the beginning, I would say, because it was maybe a little bit unexpected and we didn't know what was going to happen. But now we kind of know that they had trouble with all the loss of routines, so we could now help them go back to the more normal routines. Like there's going to be a lot of, I think, in between steps of going back to normal, probably.
Yes, and I think you're further down that road than us. Just the fact that there's two of you in a room on the camera shows that you're further down that road than us.
I think the numbers have been quite okay here since a few weeks, so some things are allowed again, but of course this brings with it new questions. What can I do? What is safe? What isn't safe? So yeah, we are constantly asking each other these questions, and I think from our results we can take that these questions are already difficult for anyone, but probably particularly difficult for neurodiverse individuals. Yeah.
Yeah, I can absolutely imagine. Oh, we've got a question from Pete. Did your research indicate any worries about others' expectations changing during the virus? Pete, I don't know if you want to just come online and speak to that. Just come on mic, I mean, not come online, you're already on.
Yeah, it's just, you presume you can hear me? Okay.
Yeah,
it's just that general idea that people will have some expectations of you during, if you like, the old world, but now we're in a completely new world, and employers, managers, etc. may feel they've got different expectations of people, and that in itself can be problematic.
I remember reading some things actually about complaints that employers do not change their expectations. I think that's more of a problem. So, you know, their expectations are high as they usually are, even though we're in a completely different world. And that is something that some people indicated that gives them stress, that, you know, employers are not always understanding enough of the of the toll that this pandemic is taking on everyone's daily life and mental health. And of course, the changes related to homeschooling for individuals that have children. I mean, that's super hard to combine with doing teleworking as well. So yeah, we don't have children, so we cannot speak on this firsthand, but yeah, I'm sure some people in the audience are. Yeah, so I think actually the expectations not being adapted to the new situation is more the issue.
That's a really good point. Thank you for that. Yes, we have children. Lots of us have children. As we speak. Yeah, good point. Okay, we've got another question from Yvette. Do you think employers will allow those with autism to work more flexibly in the future in light of the results from studies such as this one? So do you have any thoughts on that?
I hope that we get something out of this, and this being one of those things, that we can effectively make big changes and adapt to it quite well. And that for some people it is really nice to work from home a couple of days, and that it shouldn't be that much of a problem and people can adjust to it. So yes, if it's valuable for someone to work at home more, I hope there's going to be like some change, some recognition that it worked out pretty well eventually in some situations.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And also from an education perspective, it's funny how many years we have been fighting to not have to do exams, for example, and how hard the pushback has been for years and years and years. No, we must do an exam. This is how we assess. And yet suddenly we're not doing any exams at all, and it's absolutely fine. So I'm really hoping that that goes forward as well. Right?
Yeah, I think people are becoming more creative because they have to.
Yeah, but some of those solutions we have to keep in mind, and let's hope that awareness stays.
Yeah. Do you think we need some kind of like central body kind of driving this change, or making sure that these changes don't get lost?
I mean,
today, so I don't know how that would work.
It's great if maybe a university or something has, a way to centralize all these findings, because I mean, our study is just one, but I know that a lot of our colleagues are doing similar studies, maybe in children or in students or in parents of children. And, we have all these different data sets from this very unique time. So I think if there's a way to collect all of that and kind of draw some lessons for everyone, that would be super useful.
Yeah, that would. It sounds like it would be fantastic. Oh, we've got a comment from Vicky. Lockdown has been great for making us realise what assumptions we had that we didn't have strong reasons for, like exams. Yes, exactly. Like there's so many things that we just do because they're done, because that's how they're done. And when they have to change, as you say, they can be changed. Oh, Abby's raised her hand. Yes, Abby. I can't hear you. Oh, yes, now I can.
Hello, Kate. Sorry, I always have to turn my mic on. Sorry. Well, I've just been wondering whether when everyone comes back from lockdown, some people in the general public might end up sort of less tolerant of difference and diversity, having spent a lot of time in our own bubbles and maybe with people more like us. So I just wondered what you might think about that. It's not really to do with autism, but sort of diversity, difference more generally.
I was kind of hoping the opposite, to be honest. I was kind of hoping for more awareness, because we're kind of isolating ourselves a little bit now. So we know a little bit how maybe some autistic people live.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, I can see your point in terms of we've only been interacting with our own very small bubble. So we have to get used to interacting with larger groups and more different groups of people as well. But let's hope that this feeling of solidarity that it also brings about, because we're all in this together, as some people have mentioned, that is something that we can kind of keep in mind once we come out of our bubbles.
Yeah, it's so hard to know how it could go, isn't it? Because I totally see your point. I'd hope the same. I really would, that people would have a great sense of understanding. But yeah, I do see Abby's point as well, that, you know, when you're in your very small circle and you're just primarily interacting with the one or two people that you live with or that you Skype with on a regular basis.
Mhm.
And also, I think there's this idea that, you know, you kind of forget how to do the stuff that you used to do on a regular basis.
Mhm.
You know, and so what we used to do on a regular basis, like in the workplace, kind of empathizing with other people and considering other people's needs, whether some of that could get lost in a way. So I hope not.
I think we shouldn't take it for granted that everyone is just going to go back to normal as if nothing had happened. Of course, there are long-term consequences to this, and I think we have to really, really keep an eye out for that, like also long-term mental health consequences and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Oh, we've got a couple of comments from Laura here. So Laura says, I think there's a big step before universities make appropriate adjustments for autistic staff. Oh, that was Yvette. Okay. Firstly, staff have to feel they can disclose autism. Yeah. So HESA's 29. So HESA is the UK Higher Education Statistics Agency, not authority, agency. Their 2019 records show that of the 97% of full-time academic staff employed in 2017 to 18 who responded to questions about disability, only 4% believed they had any disability, and fewer than 0.02% believed they had any social or communication impairment, including autism. Wow. Okay, so you say, are universities even employing autistic people? Yeah, that's a terrifying statistic. I have no idea what to do with that.
Yeah.
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 It really is. Laura, I don't know if you fancied coming online and talking to that a little bit and saying anything about it. I don't want to put you on the spot, so feel free to not if you.
Yeah, I just I looked at that stat when I was looking at, I was having some issues with an ethics panel in terms of what I wanted to do in terms of what autistic people were saying around how they wanted to have to be called autistic people rather than people with autism, and I wasn't allowed to do that in a in a questionnaire I was handing out. So I was looking up and thinking, well, are these autistic people represented in ethics panels? Are they represented in other places? And when we think about how suitable you would imagine academic life can be for autistic people in terms of their massive interest in narrow ranges and their attention to detail, you'd think it'd fit them very nicely. I looked at the figures and found these really shocking rates and found that whilst I don't believe these figures are truly representative of how many autistic people there are in these environments, it certainly says something about whether people are prepared to state that they're autistic in these environments.
That's really interesting and absolutely horrifying at the same time. And I'm sure you're absolutely right as well. The language side of things is really interesting. I've done some research on this as well around language norms and disability more broadly, and how people are comfortable with kind of person first or identity first language, so autistic person or person with autism. And, you know, in the autism community, this is something that comes up again and again, but possibly less so in the wider disability community. And it is really interesting. But yeah, I can absolutely imagine an ethics panel just being an absolute blocker. No, you say it this way because this is the way the university says it, and it doesn't matter if the students are comfortable with that or the people that you're surveying are comfortable with it or not. And yeah, you're right. That's something that we really need to look at, is making sure that people are ideally permanently represented on things like ethics panels. But even if they're not permanently represented, that there should be a pool of people that they can call on for any kind of studies that are particularly in that area. So I'd say anyway. Any more questions for Annabel and Danna? I've got a couple of people typing, so I'll give you a minute to finish your thoughts. I really struggle with how small this chat box is in Adobe Connect, honestly. Okay. Okay, so let's put a comment at Laura. Jenny Mokes is typing something. So we'll just give it a minute in case there are any more questions. So Jenny says that career progression support needs work, as it can be a big step to change duties and activities. Yeah, absolutely right. Thank you. Good point. And Jeanette's typing, so
Could I speak instead? Sorry, it's probably quicker than me trying to type. I was just going to say that I thought it was really interesting, the research. My son is autistic, and he was diagnosed quite well. He's 16, and he was diagnosed when he was 15, and he doesn't accept the label, which makes it quite difficult to talk to him about it because he doesn't want any support, he doesn't want any help because he doesn't agree. But I also thought he was coping quite well with the pandemic because he does like to spend time by himself, he does like being at home. And actually, after we did manage a conversation, it turns out that he was finding it all very stressful, us all being at home and the change in his routine. You know, all these weeks I've been thinking, oh, he's fine, he's coping really well, but he wasn't, and it was really quite surprising. So it's interesting to see your research and the outcomes, because it makes me think about him a bit more and, you know, what is going on in his head. Because we often don't get it coming out. So thank you.
Thanks. That's great. I think that was what we wanted to reach with, you know, this study, because you hear mixed stories, like some people seem to be coping very well, but yeah, I think it's important that they are given a voice themselves to say if indeed they are coping.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Annabel and Danna, for that fantastic presentation. That was really, really interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will move on to, if anybody else has any more questions that they think of later, feel free to pop them in the chat. Or if you think of them much later after the event's finished, then you could pop them in an email again to the opentel@open.ac.uk email, and we'll be able to forward them on to Annabel and Danna. If that's okay, Annabel and Danna.
Definitely.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we will move on to our third presentation of the day, who's Laura. And you're going to be presenting live, aren't you, Laura?
I am, yes, I'm ready to go.
Fantastic. So I'll pass over to you and I'll let you introduce yourself. I'll switch my camera and my mic off, and it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Great stuff. So I'm going to be talking about autistic students in higher education, and this is a piece of research that I did for my doctorate in education, which has been a long, long piece of work. And I initially started out by looking at employability specifically, and some of the reasons why I started out with the employability angle on this was that I noticed that there were incredible differences between the graduate outcomes of autistic students to other students. So whilst HESA shows that autistic students outperform their peers academically, so they're much more likely to get a first class, they're much more likely to get a 2-1 than neurotypical students, they are not getting employed at the end of this. So AGCAS data, the Association of Graduates Careers Advisory Service data, showed that 4 times as many non-disabled graduates were employed as autistic graduates. And it's not just a disability issue here. The actual figure between disabled and non-disabled, the difference is a couple of %. Whereas we look at the difference between non-disabled versus autistic students, we're looking at 4 times difference. So massive, massive difference. And equally, when they were in full-time work, they were significantly less likely to be working at graduate level. And this has a massive number of associated problems with this. You know, being unemployed or being in poor employment is associated with mental illness. We know already that 1/3 of autistic adults develop severe mental health problems in their lives because of a lack of support. We already know that in the UK context, the Taylor review said that we don't have enough good work, good quality work for people that uses their skills and makes them feel valued in this workplace. And at the same time, the National Audit Office specifically pulled out the issue of support for autistic people who did not have associated learning difficulties, and they identified this as a specific area where, as a society, we were not supporting this group of people to reach their potential. So lots and lots of need to look at what's going wrong here. Why aren't these students achieving the graduate level work that they're hoping for at the end of their studies? And just to sort of mention as well, the flip side of this is that there are businesses that specifically look for autistic students. So it's not even that the businesses themselves aren't necessarily, you know, prepared to employ. Something's really going wrong somewhere along the way. So I wanted to look at what that was, what was going wrong, what was happening here. So the way in which I went about this was initial literature review, as we do. That was a sort of ongoing process as we went along. I did quite a large-scale questionnaire with both autistic and neurotypical students within one specific institution. So, my slide's jumping back as a board. I looked at one specific institution because what I wanted to do is really get to grips with the experiences of a specific group and not miss people out there. So I didn't want to sort of skirt across the top and get people from lots and lots of different institutions and get those people who were more prepared to be interviewed. What I wanted to do is really drill in and spend time capturing one group so that I had one group's experience. So from that initial questionnaire, I used that to inform the questions that I asked and did interviews with students with autism there. And then I matched a group of those students with control students who were neurotypical, and I matched them on things like age, gender, course of study, just to sort of pull out which things might be attributed to being autistic versus just things that all students experience there. It was really important to me as well to have ongoing context discussions with staff because I'm not autistic myself, I felt that there were certain things that I was missing or things were being reported to me, and I sort of, whilst I worked at this institution, there were sort of some things I didn't understand. So an example was one student mentioned the fact that there'd been multiple changes of staff and that they'd had 3 separate mentors in the first year, which I thought was really bad. And when I went to speak to the disability staff there, they said, oh no, that's our standard practice. We have one mentor for induction, we have to help people through induction, we have one to help them with academic skills, and we have the one to help them with social skills. And it was interesting because this individual student themselves thought it was a problem with the managing to retain staff, and that was my understanding from listening to them. So those context discussions were really useful and really flagged up a lot of things to me, like, well, why would you want somebody to have to introduce themselves and get to know 3 separate people? Could this not be one person here? So these are the people that were involved. I had 253 survey participants. From there, 49 autistic people agreed to be interviewed. When I'd been through the inclusion criteria and looked at, some of the contact details weren't right and things like that, there were actually 14 people who were sort of eligible there. So the inclusion criteria that I used were that they had to be a student of this specific university, and one person wasn't, who'd participated, and they had to be in their penultimate year. So the reason for looking at penultimate year was I didn't want students who just started, because I felt like they hadn't really got to grips with all the issues and they might be a bit wrapped up in those initial problems. I didn't want students that were in their final year because they were perhaps too focused and too busy, and I didn't want to sort of be taking their time as they were going to leave. But I thought in the second year or the penultimate year, what they should be doing really then is focusing quite a bit on career and moving forward and what they were going to do. So 14 of those original participants were interviewed there, and then also they recommended another couple of people to me, and they, through that snowballing process, I recruited those. So a couple of things to sort of mention here. One is that I really attempted to oversample females because there is a massive dearth of females in autistic research, and I also said that no diagnosis was needed because from my own experiences as a mother trying to get diagnosis for my daughter, which took many, many years to actually achieve, that actually there's many people out there who haven't got diagnoses, and that many higher education students often choose not to disclose as well. So I just simply said, do you think this? However, in the event, there were only 2 students who didn't have a diagnosis, although many of them had very, very recently got them. And that was something quite interesting to come out, that of the students who'd got them, if they hadn't got them when they were young, as in 5, 6, 7 years old, they got them when they were 17, and there was a pattern that is incredibly suspicious to me of people, of the individuals having asked and pushed and their families worked on them getting a diagnosis for many, many years, and then suddenly a diagnosis was given just as they finished their A-levels. Now, that makes me deeply suspicious because in a UK context, local authorities are responsible both for diagnosis and for providing any necessary support and adjustment necessary in the school. And I found that quite suspicious that at the point within the last month or so of their compulsory schooling career, that suddenly the diagnoses were being made. And I think it's something really to look at in the future, but not a feature of this study. So the initial questionnaire had a quantitative element to it, and I looked at that quantitative element to see, well, are we seeing any differences in what the students are doing here? We know that to be successful entering work, it's helpful if you use employability services, you go along to the career service, great if you can volunteer. Lots and lots of research to show that doing work experience, taking part in extracurricular activities, engaging in paid work, all helps you enter graduate careers. So first thing was, let's look and see if there are any difference between these things. No significant differences. Autistic students were equally likely to engage in all of these things and use services to the same extent. So then we want to look at, well, are they happy with what they're receiving then? Because is what they're receiving giving them what they want? So I asked a series of questions around how much emphasis they felt different parts of the university should help them. So university at the course level and the student union, how much should it support them in developing employability, supporting academic progression and supporting them socially, and how supported they felt. So what they thought the university should do and whether they thought the university was doing those things. Again, no significant differences. So none of this is explaining what I'm seeing here. Why am I seeing this massive difference in graduate outcomes? If the autistic students are performing better academically, they're doing the same things that the other students are doing, and they're doing their best to develop those employability skills. So there was also a qualitative element to the questionnaire, to the initial questionnaire, and I just want to pull out something in here because the questions covered a whole gamut of issues, and I can't go into them all today. But one of the things that was really powerful that came out of that was an overriding theme of exclusion and isolation. So regardless of what question I was asking, I was getting messages back around exclusion and isolation. Now, this was not exclusive to the autistic students. Some of the neurotypical students mentioned this, but it was mentioned in a different context for neurotypical students. So 13% of neurotypical students mentioned isolation, but they mentioned it in the context of either religious intolerance or having to be involved in a culture of heavy drinking, which are major problems and things that, as an institution, we would want to address. But for the autistic students, it was being mentioned in relation to everything. And they were talking about things like societies being hard to crack, wanting a list of societies that are inclusive and that I would fit in better at. And very interestingly, there were 3 separate open text responses saying, do you want to say anything else? And 3 separate autistic students there said, we'd like an autism club. Now, this was very interesting because we actually do have something at this institution. And sorry, I don't want to name the institution because I've been asked not to. But at this institution, there is something that is akin to an autism club. It's not called that exactly, but essentially it is a social space for autistic students to come together. And it is reasonably well used amongst the students who are registered with disability services. But here were 3 students who knew nothing about it and suggested the need for it. And I thought it was quite interesting when, from the neurotypical student side, we saw the request for an introvert club. And when I got on to talk to autistic students in the interviews, what I was seeing was a lot of discussion around the stigma associated with autism and not wanting to be boxed in with other autistic students because of the difficulties they perceive that might have for them later on in terms of building relationships with other people. And I thought there was some sort of perhaps potential crossover here between this idea of introvert club, autistic club. Could we make this less great if we can remove the stigma to autism, but that's quite a big ask. relabeling something, bringing in more other introverted students might be a solution there in the short term. But they also talked about the need to train people, to train other students, so the idea of inclusion officers in all societies who are trained on neurodivergence, awareness training for teachers regarding autism and autistic students. They were quite clear about some of the things that were needed there. Okay, so then I took this information forward and then went on to interview 16 students in total, 16 autistic students, and then their matched controls to look at the issues that they were having. And one of the big themes to come out of this work was the long-running impact of historical treatment on current behaviours. So bearing in mind what I was saying, around about half of the participants had only got a diagnosis in recent years, within the last 2 years. A lot of them talked about the impact that the lack of diagnosis had in the past, that whilst there was to some degree some flexibility in schools for things like desire to stim or wanting to sort of sit quietly and not go out to play with other students, or sort of reasonably minor adjustments like this, that many students talked about the when they actually asked for something that was more than a very minor ask, they were immediately told no because they didn't have a diagnosis. It didn't, they couldn't do that. And that impacted what they asked for now. They were scared to ask for things. They were quite willing to put up with quite a bit of discrimination. And I just want to read a quote from one of the students here about her attempts to get a diagnosis. She said, so it mattered because it's beyond all doubt sort of thing, and it gave me not an excuse but an explanation for things. So it meant that people couldn't tell me that I just had to get over things anymore because I'd just pull out this trump card when I'd say, well, I really have to do this little ritual. And before, people would say, you don't have to do it. And I would say, but I feel like I have to do it. I have to do it. And they would go, no, you don't. No, you don't. Don't be so stupid. And now I can say, even though it's exactly the same process, I say, I feel like I have to do it because I have Asperger's. And everybody goes, okay then, if it's because you've got Asperger's, then of course you have to do it. When of course all along it's the same process, the same need, but then people are more respectful of it because it's got a reason that they can name. And this, disclosure diagnosis issue, really, really big and important, I feel, in terms of, something that universities need to attempt to do to support students to sort of get this name. Other students talked as well about the need to mask, as you've heard earlier on, the cognitive load involved in masking or pretending to be neurotypical, having long-term impacts on people's mental illness and their ability, their emotional resource and ability to manage on a day-to-day basis. Now, another thing that came because of this historical treatment was that the students were quite tolerant, that I spoke with, were quite tolerant of poor treatment. So here's a couple of quotes. So one saying, one lecturer said to me that she never read the disability notes attached to students' assignments and she thought they were a terrible idea, but we were allowed to ask for more time as it would just make us used to being able to ask for it. So I followed this up with a sort of question around, and did you report that back? Because obviously she has, under the Equality Act in the UK, she has a requirement to make the adjustments. The Disability Services have said what the adjustments need to be, and she's not doing it. And she said, well, no, that's just what happens. That, that's how it is. There's no point in me reporting it back. Similarly, a student reported, and this student was telling me how much better it was at university, how much more support there was, how much more help she had. And she said, there's this class I go to, I'm supposed to go to a room with about 20 other people. But because everyone's really noisy in there, I'm allowed to go to a different separate room and study there and stuff. So they're supposed to have it so that one of the PhD students comes up to one of the rooms I'm in and asks if I need any extra help. So we were about 6 or 7 weeks into term at this point, and I said, how does that work? Do you get on with this PhD student? Oh, I've never met her. I said, well, but when she comes up to do, I said, oh, is it a different person? She said, oh, they've never actually come. And again, it was this acceptance that even though an adjustment had been made, it had been put on a formal learning plan, it had been sent out to the department, and it was this formal thing that should happen. The student never thought that she should complain that this wasn't being received. Even when recounting this incredible failure of the service that had gone on for weeks, she was praising any idea that there was an attempt at adjustment, even if it didn't work. Her expectations were so low about what she should receive. And then a lot came out in terms of symptom-related issues and adjustments. And we know that there are a whole range of issues that autistic students may face in education, so problems with organisational problems, inability to self-advocate, sensory overload. You know, in the workplace, we hear concerns around individuals might display inappropriate affective expressions or lack of social skills. And they may have problems with, you know, conversations, considering listeners' interests, a whole range of different issues. We know all of this. We've got lots of research to say these are the problems that autistic students are having. And consequently, you know, the massive focus of calls today has been to try and teach to make up for the deficit in this. We'll sort of teach these skills instead. And what was coming out really strongly through my sample was that this idea that teaching and adjustment doesn't work, because even if people have been taught, you know, how to manage reciprocal elements of conversation, for example, it never becomes natural. And consequently, there's always a massive cognitive load associated with this. And that actually what the universities need to do, what employers need to do, is actually change, you know, actually make the adjustments on the other side, not expect always the autistic student to be the one learning different ways of doing it, learning how to act in a neurotypical way. And you know, a lot came out for me in terms of the importance of teaching students, instead of how to act in neurotypical ways, rather about what their legal requirements were or rights were for adjustment. Talk them about ideas like job crafting, where employers can change jobs so that, you know, certain high stress elements can be taken out and they can focus on the bits that they're particularly good at and they like doing. There was a lot around inappropriate adjustments, and these were well-meaning adjustments. So one student spoke to me about having the requirement to do presentations was removed. So they said, well, but in the real world I have to. It's all about doing presentations. With others it's about that. I'd have to so doing presentations on my own, that doesn't prepare me. It's worse. It doesn't prepare me for the real world. So in a well-meaning way, the institution has said, you don't have to do this group presentation. But he recognised that actually, for a graduate job, you're quite likely to have to do a presentation. You're quite likely to have to do it in a group as part of the selection process. And so removing that requirement did not help him at all. All that did was make, you know, kick the can down the road, as it were, you know, create problems for later on. And it was sort of the easiest solution for the university at that point. Similarly, offering a buddy system. So this student reported, hearing the description of that, I thought it would be very useful, and I immediately realised that wasn't the case. I never met with my buddy because it was just another social interaction I had to have in Freshers Week. Now, I feel like as a neurotypical person, that would seem like an obvious solution to me. Give somebody a buddy who will support them through and talk them through, you know, the social requirements in the first few weeks at university. But in speaking to the individual student, they're already overwhelmed. They just don't need that extra person. And what was coming out was that the adjustments seemed to be coming somewhat off a ticklish. You know, these are things that you might find helpful, but they were all coming from a neurotypical perspective. They weren't coming from the individual themselves. And thinking back to that idea of, you know, accepting, you know, previous bad treatment, these students didn't know what to ask for. They didn't know how to advocate for themselves. So when the learning plans were being set up, they didn't know what to ask for, and something was being set up for them that was then not appropriate. And just one more example here. So this is one about a student who'd been taken out of a noisy environment and put into a quiet one for exams. So she said, I actually have the opposite problem when I'm taking my exams and stuff. I have the opposite problem because they try to make everything silent, and noises I could ignore, like the lights, like some of the lights, then they become so overwhelming again because there's no background noise to drown them out, and it makes it quite difficult to concentrate and keep track of time, because I can use noise to keep track of time. Like if you hear the long buzzing of the lights, it's easy to drift off and daydream because there's nothing to break it up. There's no other sounds. She didn't want to be in a room just by herself, but it was really hard to manage that right level of stimulation that she needed in that environment. And it was a sort of all or nothing. Either you're in this exam hall, you know, with 200 other students, or you're completely on your own in this room with a fluorescent light ticking away. And another example I think that was quite helpful for me was a student who talked a lot about the need for personal control, and as long as he was in control of the environment, then it was okay. Interestingly, he worked as a technician in a nightclub, and he said, I work in a nightclub, but I'd never go to one as the crowd, just in a working position. When it's a working position, there is for me a distance from the crowd, but it's very noisy and a lot of people. And he explained that even though that seems like the worst environment for an autistic person to be in, he explained that the personal control was what made the difference there. He said, one of the things I like about that role is that I can choose where I go within it. So if I'm operating the lights, there's always a fence or a pole and space, and I can move around within it. If I feel I don't really want to be near people, then I can always go backstage, dressing room, sit down and relax. And this idea came from a lot of students, the idea of simply being allowed to do what they chose and what felt right for them at that particular moment. You know, being allowed to walk out of a lecture theatre, being able to leave a space that was uncomfortable for them, meant that they often didn't need to. Knowing that they could meant that they didn't need to. So, it's about giving that control back again. And I think this is quite interesting, given we've spoken about exams already. This was a very articulate response from one of my interviewees. I always think that these adjustments that they have for exams and so to make these easy for people, I just think it's silly to have adjustments for exams, because the problems that people with autism have with exams, they're problems that are inherent in exams. It's the exams in the first place. It's the going and sitting in a room and writing down all this knowledge with no outside help in a really artificial situation that's a problem. And you can't, you can do all these little things to fix it, but you're not fixing the core problem. There's things like that where they're not actually addressing the core problem, just trying to plaster over it. But I still think the adjustments are useful and everything, but you're better off using that time and energy to come up with a better assessment system. And so really a lot of good self-reflection going on for these students, and great advice, to bring back to the university. Another theme that came out quite strongly in the research was the idea about managing identity and when to disclose. And we know there's a really strong positive correlation between autism and both anxiety and depression. And we also know that suppression of identity has been shown to be highly correlated with anxiety and depression in other stigmatized groups, for example, gay and lesbian people. So, I think we need to think about the notion of suppressing identity and what impact that can potentially have. We also know that autistic people are significantly more likely to both engage in suicide ideation and to kill themselves. So, a quite shocking large-scale Swedish study looked at all known adults with autism and showed with matched samples, basically matched each autistic person with a matched neurotypical adult and found that autistic individuals were more than 7.5 times more likely to kill themselves. And the figures were much higher amongst higher functioning groups, and there was a significant gender effect there with more women doing so. And a lot of that's attributed to the idea of masking and the associated pressures involved in masking. It's a very stressful thing to do. And for many of my students, they were talking about the idea that if and when they chose to disclose, that brought with it some extra load in terms of a requirement on them to teach other people, to teach their peers, or to teach the staff what autism was. And felt very much that this needed to be thrown back to the university as a whole. The university needs to be responsible for making sure that other students and staff recognise what autism is. This should not be put onto them as an additional problem. And another issue came through the idea of the hidden curriculum. So the hidden curriculum was where students were talking about simply not understanding things, So one student reported, I was reading, I was doing the reading, but they knew things and I don't. As I say, it was taking me a long time, and they sort of knew things already, and I thought, they didn't seem to know things together. It took its toll. And another student said they had ideas which But as I say, I don't know why. It was things what we weren't told to do. What was coming out was that it seemed students were missing things that weren't explicitly taught. And it might be because they were missing cues, because of distraction, or it might be that they weren't engaging with or interacting with other people. So one student gave me an example of, he was a veterinary student, and he described how when they were working on a cow, he was told there was a poor prognosis for the cow. And he'd sort of missed the sort of terminology being used here, poor prognosis, rather than this was a financial issue, because he knew full well that if a dog or a cat had the same problem, that the dog or cat would be treated. But talking in those sort of euphemisms around poor prognosis did not teach him what was necessary here, was that people feel differently about dogs and cats than they do about cows as a rule, and so therefore won't spend the money on a cow that they will spend on a dog or a cat. So there needs to be some element of explicitness or directness in the communication that wasn't going on. There was also sort of misunderstanding of, hyperbole. So one student described how they'd been warned, if you don't get work experience right now, if you don't apply before December, there's no point, you won't get any. Basically, it's now or never. Now, she took that as a fact, that sort of off the cuff, get on with this, stress, encouraging students to do something. She didn't do it, so then it was gone, so she didn't bother, felt like there was no point anymore. So a lot of students suggested different ways of building better systems, and I've sort of mentioned some of them as I've gone through here, but some that were specifically coming out was the idea around having specific careers advisors who themselves were neurodivergent, so that they could understand individuals as in a holistic way. The idea or the call for neurodiverse mentors, events that were specifically for neurodivergent and disabled people to explicitly talk about their experiences of entering work and the issues that they'd found. But a lot of it came down to the need to reframe services away from matching individuals, like you'd be suitable for this job, this person, environment approach to career, and actually having a much more reflexive approach and talking about chaotic patterns of workplaces and recognizing that autistic students would need support in working with employers to look at how roles could be adapted. Because the reasonable adjustments that are required by the Equality Act are not just about giving somebody a pair of headphones so they can drown out the extra auditory stimuli. It's about actually restructuring a job so that the job meets the needs of that individual. And the idea that autistic people's development needs are often impacted by neurotypical understandings of success. So many of the students were talking about the need to, what they were looking for from work was something where they felt comfortable, they felt that they were using their skills. So few talked about some of those traditional ideas of success as earning a lot of money, reaching the top of a career ladder. It just wasn't important to the group that I spoke to. And the one student who said that money was valuable to her explained that it wasn't the money in itself, it was that the money gave her a degree of success so that she could be independent. And it was the independence that she was valuing there. So that was quite different and quite different to how many career service, no, actually that's not fair, not career services themselves, but the way careers events often run, or the messages that we give to students about the need to sort of climb a career ladder and reach these high levels. This was not what they were looking for this particular group, and we needed some more exploration of that. Now, this was not a perfect piece of research. There were, a lot of things that I would do differently if I was doing this again, but I think it's brought out some really helpful things, some things that I think would be useful to look at in the future. I'd like to do some exploration of the intersectional aspects of identity, because there was definitely a class issue impacting here, students' expectations of career, and there was certainly some gender things going on there that would be worth looking at more closely. I think it would also be worthwhile looking at the impact of diagnosis and what that meant in terms of whether people had managed to achieve a diagnosis, and for those people who simply just missed the clinical threshold, so had been referred for a diagnosis but didn't get one, it'd be really helpful to have a speak to those students as well about, you know, what they would find particularly useful. But, you know, lots of recommendations for practice came out of this work. The idea that it'd be helpful to have fixed contacts for autistic students so that they, you know, knew the same person as they go through. And I think in the OU we're quite good at that within modules. You know, they have one AL and they have that contact, but then they have another AL for the next module. And so, you know, to have another person, to have one person as we went through might be really helpful there. The employability aspects of programs need to be considered holistically as part of individual learning plans. That this is, you know, this is part of the learning experience. Working with autistic students that they recognise their own legal rights and they feel secure in self-advocating, and particularly developing risk management strategies for autistic students who have increased risk of mental illness, because at this particular institution they were viewed as separate issues. You know, a diagnosis of a mental illness and an autism diagnosis were viewed as two separate issues, and there was no sort of consideration of the intersection of those things. And then a whole range of specific sessions for autistic students, which might be around interpersonal communication and relationship building, might be about disclosure, do they want to do it, practical things around communication, you know, what you should what you're expected to look like in this environment, and do you want to do it? So actually not just that this is what's expected, but a conversation, an active conversation around, well, how far do you want to go along with this? Do you want to mask or not? And then the DDSS, which is the Disability Services in this institution, a recommendation that they actively explore whether adjustments that have been made are actually being experienced by the students or not. If they're just expected that they will be used. The students themselves asked for the university to work with employers to reduce stigma around the condition, and they also put forward themselves the need for qualified career staff to be involved in curriculum design and service planning to make sure that that was built into programs. It wasn't just an additional add-on element. Overall, big message around rejecting deficit models of employability and focusing on strengths, and actively encouraging applications by autistic people for university posts, specifically, you know, in these sort of mentoring or buddying services, which were specifically requested here. So lots and lots of messages for the university themselves there. I also put forward, you know, a few recommendations for autistic students to think about. You know, the making sure that they understood their own legal rights to adjustments and regarding demonstration. Encouraging to take time to explore hidden rules of employability and taking responsibility for employability development as part of overall learning there. And really a message about, you know, not expecting to not be employed, because that's a terrible message to give out, but an idea that there are a lot of barriers and that it is really hard to overcome those barriers. And if you don't overcome those barriers, don't feel that this is a personal failing. This is a system and these are systemic problems, and that, you know, if you personally end up without work, make sure that, you know, you recognise that within a social model and not as an individual failing, which I think that, you know, we really push this notion of individual failing on students of all types at the moment. And then, you know, some messages around the sort of idea of spinning skills and you know, and being, you know, being able to sell the strength that they have there. So that was a super quick rattle through what was an enormously large project there, and lots of other things that I could go into, but I want to leave a bit of time for questions and comments and issues from people. So nice to hear from you. Any questions?
Thanks so much, Laura. So anybody, if you want to put any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat, or you can feel free to just speak, whatever you prefer.
Hi, Kate. It's Kathy here. Laura, I'm from the OU Careers and Employability Service. And just to say, I recognise everything you've said. Absolutely, yeah. And thank you so much for that. I think you hit the nail on the head. And just to let everyone know, we are running a neurodiversity project at the moment, which will be reporting back in the autumn, because we're very aware we want to develop the service we offer for our students with autism. So that is on the go. But yes, we do, when we approach employers, we do ask them to consider a wide range of issues, not only autism, but mental illness, other forms of disability, and widening participation as well. So that is on our agenda when we talk to employers, and not forgetting our students in prison, of course. But we do recognise the need you've identified here, and I like the idea of asking students with autism to be involved in our planning, which I shall take back to my colleagues who are involved in the Neurodiversity project. So thank you very much.
Great, that all sounds really promising. It's good to hear that you already picked this up as an issue, and I would absolutely endorse the idea of getting students themselves involved and feeding back in.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Kathy. That sounds great. Okay, any other questions? We've got a comment from Vicky in the chat. I'm surprised by the statement that autistic students outperform neurotypical peers academically. Is that only where they have a diagnosis and adjustment?
So this comes from HESA data. If you look at students who have autism diagnoses, they do outperform at both undergraduate and postgraduate level neurotypical students. I mean, we can assume that they have adjustments in place for that. But yeah, I think I didn't really get to this in my presentation, but I had quite a number of students talk about, the social thing isn't working, I'm not getting any friends, I'm just going to buckle down and focus on my academic work. And it might be that massive focus on the academic element, and they're not out partying and things on a night time, actually means that they're more successful in that academic way.
Yeah, and in the OU as well. I don't think there's actually a positive gap, but I think there's no significant difference with OU students, if I remember rightly. John Richardson did a load of work on it a few years ago. I don't know if anybody else can remember that better than me. I'm casting my mind back, it was in like 2015 or something like that. No one else can remember. I know he did a load of work on, he worked through all of the disability categories, and I'm pretty sure that with autism there was no significant difference in attainment in the OU context. It was only for one specific cohort of data. But it's interesting when you look at it compared to all the other different disability categories and how the gaps are different for different ones. Like, so for mental health, for example, there was in his particular cohort, there was a large module completion gap, but no significant attainment gap when you normalised all the other characteristics and things. But yeah, other disabilities, and particularly unseen disabilities, had a much larger gap. So I think it is interesting. Wasn't my experience, but nice to know it can be different. Yeah, and it's worth mentioning, Vicky, we do an awful lot of adjustments as well. I mean, in my role, we deal with the complex cases where students need particular adjustments, and there are things that they can really, really struggle with, particularly the more collaborative elements, any kind of group work, collaborative work. Reflection is one that comes up a lot as well. Trying to take part in any kind of reflective activity can be really challenging as well. So yeah, I suppose a lot of it depends on the discipline as well. So any other questions? I can see somebody's typing. Oh, Hannah's typing. ASD is relatively new OU data category. Many of our students who declared under the old classification were in the other unseen category. Really? Okay. How new is relatively new? I'm intrigued now. So I think John's study was quite old. I mean, I don't know. It's been there as long. It's been there for 5 years, but maybe it's I don't know how much longer. Yeah, 5 years is the one that I know of, and that's just because that's how long I've been in the OU now. You're right, it is new in the data. I don't know how much longer it's been there. I think longer than that, but I don't know how long it's been. 8 years, 10 years, I don't know. I know John Richardson started his work in 2009, but I don't think he did the autism stuff until much later. Yeah, any other comments or questions? Multiple attendees are typing. Okay, I'll give you a minute. All you multiple attendees. Oh, wow. Okay. So Maxine says there's clearly a tension here for students. One student mentioned that whilst the adjustments are helpful, they're not preparing them for the real world. Obviously, in an ideal world, employers would make appropriate adaptations. But yes, now that really resonated with me as well. Sorry, Laura, I didn't know if you wanted to speak to that.
Yes, I think it's quite a difficult one because there is a sort of desire to make things easy in the immediate term. But I think from a university perspective, it's really easy just to say, you don't need to do this thing. That's really fast, cheap solution to a problem. Whereas actually to have some one-to-one tuition on, how to present or how to deal with it, is actually quite, financially costly. So it's not the sort of adaptation that a university is likely to take. And I think a lot of the students are talking about, some of these are sort of, I can pull these off a list. I can easily give you longer library book loans. I can easily give you 20% extra time in exam. But actually, is that helping? Are these things helpful at all? I can easily say you don't have to do the presentation. And in the immediate, when I'm feeling overwhelmed as a student, I'll go, yeah, I'll take that. But actually, I'm not in a good position later on because at some point I'm going to have to do that presentation for an employer later on.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think any kind of top-down adjustment is generally not helpful. Having said that, I find the counter-argument to that, which I hear sometimes, that the student doesn't want to do the presentation, and then their module team will come back and say, no, but they have to do the presentation because they'll need to do that if they ever get a job. And then often the student isn't, particularly in the OU context, they might not be doing that degree because they want to get a job. They might be doing that degree because of love and interest in the subject. So yeah, I think I'd agree with you that any kind of top-down, auto-fit adjustments are just not right, and everything should be negotiated carefully with the student. Although I totally take your point that a lot of times they won't know what they need as well. Any more questions? I can't see any more coming up. So Laura, thank you so much. Oh, okay, one from Fiona. Are there any sources of guidance available to help with supporting students for collaborative and reflective activities in modules? Well, actually, that provides a nice little segue to the last activity, if that's okay. If everybody's okay, if you have any more questions for Laura, either pop them in the chat and we'll come back to them and email them to Laura directly, or feel free to contact Laura directly, if that's okay, Laura.
Yep, that's great. I'll pop my email address in the box.
Perfect. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. Thank you to all the speakers for 3 fascinating presentations. Okay, we've got 5 minutes before we finish, and I just wanted to draw your attention to some guidance that I'm drafting now. I know a lot of people have got to run, so it's only going to be a core group of us. But I just wanted to show you this quickly, get some initial thoughts on it, and then if you want to email me with any other bits and pieces that you think of, that would be great. So I'll just zoom in so hopefully we can see that. Can everybody see the Designing Learning for Autistic and Neurodiverse students in the box there? Yeah, green tick's coming up, good, so that's fine. Okay, so just to let you know, sorry, just scroll back up to the top. Okay. It's popping around, somebody else is obviously scrolling at the same time. Okay, so I'll scroll through it centrally for everybody if that's okay. So people have been asking for a long time for guidance, basically, training and guidance. So I've started drafting this just from my experience in organising sort of adjustments and things for autistic students. But I really want to crowdsource the wisdom on this from everybody else who's involved in this area or has lived experience of this area through themselves, through a family member, any kind of research interest in this area, anything like that. So just to run you through very quickly the categories that I'm working on. If you've got any feedback or comments as I go through, if you could pop it in the comments. If you want to read it in more detail and give me some more detailed comments, drop me an email and I will send you the document. But basically what we're working with is a little definition of autism and neurodiversity at the beginning, talking about, I'm trying to frame this in a very kind of positive way, because what you see in a lot of these things is how people with autism are different, and I kind of want to make it more inclusive, if you see what I mean. So the guidance is around raising awareness of some of the differences that autistic people might experience, and to help educators design learning activities, tutorials and assessment that help autistic students to demonstrate their potential on a more level playing field. I've got a little note next on terminology, about the terminology that I've used in this, because it's something that's particularly contentious in the field. I don't want to use the words disorder, for example, or even condition. I prefer to talk about the autism spectrum and autism as a thing, because that's what research has shown is more popular. But if anybody's got any comments on that, do feel free to jump in. And then there's basically just a kind of list of considerations for people. So there's a section, don't generalise. All autistic people are different. Societal generalizations about autism, such as autistic people don't make eye contact or autistic people are hyper intelligent, are only true for certain people and not the majority, and these stereotypes can be distressing. I found a lot of people have said to me in the past that people will say, but you can't be autistic, you're making eye contact with me right now, and things like this. It can be quite upsetting to have to explain yourself over and over again. So I wanted to have a section on don't generalise. I wanted to have a section on avoiding figurative language. I've got a load of comments from people on this already, so thank you. I haven't had time to incorporate them yet because they've just come through kind of Friday and today, and I've been in meetings all morning. But yes, I wanted to have something around language and avoiding figurative language and metaphor and stuff, and so that does need a little bit of work. But if anybody's got any comments or areas that they'd like to add to there, that'd be great. I wanted to have a section on anxiety, because as I think a few of the speakers have said, there is a correlation between anxiety and autism, particularly social anxiety, and kind of so trying to make it easier for the students so that they can know about things in advance. Okay, somebody's just scrolled up and down and now I've lost where I was. Okay, where was I? So designing for anxiety. Right, I'm going to whiz through the rest really fast. Something around inclusive collaborative work, which I think is the thing that somebody was just asking about. So a little bit about how you can make collaborative work more inclusive for students. And particularly my colleague Elaine McPherson has done a load of work on this, and so I wanted to signpost her website that gives a load of different ways about how you can have different group roles and support people to take a different role in the group so that not everybody's expected to do the same thing, and other bits and pieces like that. On her website, she's got guidance for module teams designing collaborative activities and guidance for tutors or people who are delivering collaborative activities. It's a really good website, so I recommend it. Section on reflective activities as well, because this is the other one that comes up a lot. There's been research that suggests that some autistic people, at least, don't necessarily have the same kind of internal monologue or inner voice that neurotypical people might have. And so that's one of the reasons it's been suggested that reflective activities can be difficult, to say the least. So this isn't the case for everybody at all, but I'd be really interested to get any thoughts that anybody has on this, because I found this quite a tricky area to research. I just know it from experience that it's something that students ask for a lot, adjustments to reflective activities. And I've tried to put in there that the main thing that we do is try to avoid the terms like reflection, because it causes anxiety, and try to suggest giving a factual account rather than a reflective account, and asking probing questions about it to stimulate reflection. Speaking of stimulation, the next one is around overstimulation. It's particularly for face-to-face environments, but can also be for module design. I know one of our modules had a problem where the main image was extremely garish, and it was a real problem for a lot of students. The section on timed information assimilation activities, and anything that's timed can be tricky because autistic students can either be faster or slower than neurotypical students, depending on the nature of the information and the way that it's being assimilated. A section on clothing and gender fluidity as well. So just being a little bit inclusive around that side of things too. So at this point, we're 1 minute over, so I'll stop. But if anybody has any comments or any of those sections, or would like to suggest any sections that I've missed, please do get in touch. I'd really appreciate it if this guidance was something that came from everybody. So at this point, because we are over time, I'll just say once again a huge thank you to our 3 wonderful speakers. Thank you so much for making this such a brilliant event. I've really, really enjoyed it and learned a lot. Thank you also to Paco, the co-lead on this group, for being amazing with the technology, which was giving us such a headache on Friday, you wouldn't believe, and for managing everything so seamlessly. You guys were thinking I was doing this. I was doing none of it, I promise. Thank you to Christina for organising it, and thank you to all the wonderful participants for coming. Do feel free to stay in touch. Give us a shout if you've got any questions. There will be a recording which Christina will put up. And in the meantime, get in touch with Christina if you want to come to future events. Thank you very much, everybody.